Welcome to the Deep Dive, the show where we take a stack of your sources, articles, research, your own notes, and really extract the most important nuggets of knowledge or insight. Think of it as your shortcut to being truly well-informed, maybe with some surprising facts, and hopefully just enough humor to keep you hooked. Today, we're taking a really profound dive into a concept that's, well, it's as universal as breathing, hope. It's that fundamental human experience, that quiet conviction, or sometimes, a roaring belief that things will get better. We've all felt it. In fact, a global Gallup study found that an astonishing 89% of people worldwide believe their lives will improve in the future. That's an incredible level of shared human optimism, isn't it? But here's the crucial question, the one that really underpins our exploration today. Is hope just another word for wishful thinking? How do we actually discern between a motivating vision that propels us forward and a dangerous delusion that kind of blinds us to reality? This phenomenon, as powerful as it is, can certainly be a double-edged sword.
Precisely, yeah. And that's exactly the mission for this deep dive. We're going to unpack this complex interplay, drawing from a really fascinating array of disciplines. We're talking psychology, the inner workings, the intricate pathways revealed by neuroscience, and even, the profound philosophical debates that have shaped our understanding of knowledge and truth for centuries. Our journey today isn't just about abstract academic theories, though. It's about extracting practical wisdom. We want to provide you with frameworks to truly understand these concepts and, maybe more importantly, give you actionable strategies for navigating your own thoughts and beliefs. We'll explore the science behind how our brains generate both genuine hope and that, well, sometimes tricky phenomenon of wishful thinking. We'll delve into the historical quest to define truth scientifically and ultimately bring it all together to understand how faith and science can actually find some powerful common ground. And this becomes incredibly vital, especially in moments of crisis, guiding us towards, hopefully, a resilient, meaningful life when we face uncertainty and these big existential challenges.
Okay, let's unpack this right from the start then. We're talking about hope, but specifically, let's focus on its often misunderstood cousin, wishful thinking. What exactly is wishful thinking, and how does it truly differ from, say, a healthy, grounded dose of optimism? Because, on the surface, they can often feel pretty similar, can't they? Our sources give a really clear definition here. Wishful thinking is the formation of beliefs based on what is pleasing to imagine rather than on evidence, rationality, or reality. So it's basically when our desires, what we want to be true, override our logical assessment of what is true.
That's a critical distinction to make, yeah. Because while they might share a positive outlook, their foundations are entirely different. Optimism is a general positive expectation about the future, absolutely, but it's usually tempered by an awareness of challenges, risks, and a willingness to acknowledge facts. It operates, within the bounds of what's realistically possible. Maybe recognizing obstacles exist, but believing in your capacity to overcome them. Wishful thinking, on the other hand, often deliberately disregards contradictory evidence. It really does. It leads you to make decisions primarily based on what you desire to be true, not what the facts or objective probabilities support. It's about downplaying risks, maybe exaggerating positive outcomes, or simply ignoring inconvenient truths because the preferred outcome is just so emotionally appealing. It's the difference between believing you can succeed if you work hard and believing you will succeed just because you really, really want to.
So it's not just a random quirk of personality, then. It's something deeply wired into how our brains actually work. That's really fascinating. Tell us more about the psychological and neural mechanisms that fuel this, because I think many of us assume it's like a conscious choice, but it sounds like it's often happening beneath the surface.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And that's what makes it so compelling and sometimes so hard to spot in ourselves. Wishful thinking isn't merely a flaw or some kind of conscious indulgence. It serves deeper psychological and even evolutionary purposes. It's a fundamental aspect of human cognition. And it's heavily influenced by several powerful cognitive biases that subtly and often unconsciously shape our perception of reality. One of the most potent drivers is confirmation bias. This is our natural tendency to seek out, interpret, and remember information that confirms our existing desires or beliefs. And at the same time, we simultaneously dismiss, devalue, or just plain overlook contradictory evidence. It's like we have filters on. If you're rooting for a particular sports team, your brain is almost automatically looking for plays and stats that affirm their strength, right? And you might conveniently forget or explain away moments of weakness. Similarly, if you wish for a certain personal outcome, your brain is actively scanning for data points to support that desired future, subtly filtering out anything that might challenge it.
Okay, so we're actively seeking proof for what we want. What else is going on?
Well, then there's optimism bias, sometimes called unrealistic optimism. This is that incredibly common tendency we all have, pretty much, to overestimate the likelihood of positive events happening to us specifically. And conversely, we underestimate the probability of negative ones hitting us. We might genuinely believe we're less likely to be in a car accident, get sick, or lose our job than the average person, even when statistics would suggest otherwise. It's a comforting illusion, sure, but an illusion nonetheless.
I can definitely see that one in myself sometimes.
Right, we all can. Adding to this mix is the self-serving bias. This is where we attribute our successes to our own abilities and efforts, internal factors, but conveniently blame our failures on external circumstances beyond our control. The test was unfair. The traffic made me late. This is a brilliant ego protection mechanism, really. But it can unfortunately reinforce unrealistic expectations about future outcomes, as we never fully internalize the lessons from our missteps.
So we take the credit, but not the blame.
Pretty much. And our current emotional state plays a significant role, too, through the affect heuristic. This just means if we're feeling particularly positive, hopeful, or even just in a good mood, we're more inclined to believe in a positive outcome, even if the objective evidence doesn't fully support it. Our emotions can truly color our rational assessment. We start believing something is good simply because it feels good to think about. And briefly, while not a direct bias in the same way, the Dunning-Kruger effect can certainly fuel unrealistic expectations. Think of that person who's absolutely terrible at singing, maybe, but genuinely believes they're a rock star. That's the Dunning-Kruger effect at play. It's where a lack of competence actually leads to an overestimation of one's own skill, which then feeds into unrealistic confidence about future success.
Wow. So these are not just simple mental errors. They're deeply ingrained processes. They seem designed to protect us or motivate us in some way. But you mentioned they have evolutionary advantages. That sounds incredibly counterintuitive. Why would our brains be wired to be less realistic?
It does seem odd at first glance, doesn't it? But when you look at it from an adaptive perspective, it starts to make a lot more sense. Wishful thinking isn't simply a cognitive flaw. It can act as a really powerful coping mechanism during times of intense stress, anxiety, or profound uncertainty. Believing things will turn out well provides a kind of psychological buffer. It offers comfort and helps us manage difficult emotions, even if only temporarily. It can also create an illusion of control when we're faced with situations genuinely beyond our immediate influence, reducing those crippling feelings of helplessness. This inherent human need for control is a deep motivator, and wishful thinking can sometimes satisfy that need, even if falsely.
Okay, so it helps us feel better, feel more in control.
Right. And perhaps most profoundly, it's a critical driver for motivation and goal setting. Think about it. A fundamental belief in a positive outcome is often the very spark needed to begin and then persist with truly daunting challenges. Imagine an entrepreneur starting a business with incredibly slim odds of success. If they didn't have a strong, almost wishful belief in their eventual triumph, why would they ever take that leap? This forward-looking belief drives ambition, perseverance, and encourages us to even try in the face of overwhelming odds. And sometimes emotional regulation comes into play. By downplaying a painful truth through wishful thinking, we can protect ourselves from immediate, overwhelming emotional distress. It allows our minds to process difficult realities at a slower, more manageable pace. And finally, don't forget social influence. Shared optimism within a group, like a team or a community, can create a powerful feedback loop that strengthens individual wishful thinking, fostering collective action and belief.
That's a really comprehensive picture of how our brains are wired for this. But here's where it gets truly mind-bending, at least for me. Our sources mention something called wishful seeing. This isn't just about believing something, it's about actually perceiving the world differently based on our desires. Can you elaborate on that? It sounds almost like our eyes can be tricked by our hopes.
It's a remarkable phenomenon, yeah. It truly challenges our everyday assumptions about reality. Wishful seeing is the concept where a person's internal state, their desires, needs, emotional context, directly influences their visual perception. It suggests that we don't always perceive the world as it objectively is, but rather through a filter shaped by what we want to see.
Okay, how is this even discovered?
Well, the concept gained traction back in the 1950s, notably through the work of psychologists Jerome Bruner and Cecile Goodman. In their classic 1947 study, they did this experiment with children. They asked them to estimate the size of various coins by adjusting a little circular light beam to match what they saw. On average, the children overestimated the coin sizes by about 30%. Okay, maybe just perception error. But here's the truly astonishing part. In a follow-up, they divided the children by economic status, poor and rich groups. Both groups overestimated the sizes, sure, but the poor group overestimated by as much as 50% up to 30% more than the children from wealthier backgrounds. Bruder and Goodman concluded that the poorer children, because they had a greater desire for money, literally perceived the coins as larger. Their desire subtly, yet profoundly, altered their visual reality.
Wow, they saw them as bigger because they wanted them more. Have modern studies backed this up?
Oh, absolutely. More recent studies, using much more sophisticated methods, have consistently replicated and expanded on these effects. For instance, in experiments by Belcetis and Dunning, participants were shown ambiguous stimuli, like a figure that could be seen as either the letter B, or the number 13, or an image that looked like both a horse and a seal. When one interpretation was associated with a desirable outcome, say, seeing the B meant you'd get tasty orange juice, while 13 meant you got, I don't know, the undesirable health food, smoothie participants were significantly more likely to perceive the desired stimulus. They literally saw the B more often. Other studies showed that thirsty people perceived a bottle of water as physically closer than non-thirsty individuals. People given positive feedback on a test saw the test results sheet as closer to them, compared to those who got negative feedback. Even gift cards appeared closer if they represented a higher value.
That is wild. So it's not just a cognitive trick, it's a genuinely perceptual one. And the brain activity related to this is also quite specific, right? It's not just a general blurring of lines.
Exactly. Neuroscientific studies using fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, have actually identified specific brain regions involved in these wishful thinking and seeing tasks. They found different patterns of activity in areas like the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex, the parietal lobe, and the fusiform gyrus, which is in the occipital lobe, involved in visual processing. The activity in the occipital and parietal areas suggests a kind of selective attention to cues. Our brains are literally prioritizing and focusing on visual information that supports our desires. It influences what even reaches conscious perception.
But what about the prefrontal cortex? That's usually linked to higher thinking, right?
Yes, and that's where the real insight comes from. The prefrontal cortex activity is strongly linked to higher cognitive processing, social identification, and crucially, the brain's reward system. When visual cues are personally relevant or tied to something an individual strongly identifies with, like their favorite football team scoring, the prefrontal cortex activates, this self-identification carries a hedonic value, basically creating a pleasurable feeling, which then stimulates the brain's reward system. And this reward system, in turn, actively guides our visual attention, influencing what we choose to see and how we interpret it. So our desires don't just influence what we think we see, they activate a neural pathway that literally shapes how we process visual information, leading to wishful seeing. It's truly mind-boggling how much our internal world dictates our external perception. Athletes, 2 softball players seeing the ball bigger, hit better, tennis players seeing the net lower, return better. It's quite something.
It's incredible to think that our hopes can physically alter our perceived reality. But here's the truly striking part. Okay, so wishful thinking has roots deep in our brain. It can even alter our perception. But is it always a bad thing? It sounds like it could also be incredibly beneficial, almost a superpower if used correctly.
That's the perfect phrasing, the core of its double-edged sword nature. It's a fundamental human tool, absolutely. But like any powerful tool, it demands discernment, doesn't it? When channeled appropriately, wishful thinking, or maybe better put, the capacity for it, can be an incredible ally. When left unchecked, though, it can indeed be a perilous guide. Let's look at the bright side first, because there are profound benefits. When wishful thinking becomes your ally, it's really about harnessing belief as an impetus for action. A fundamental belief in a positive outcome is often the very spark needed to begin and then persist with really challenging endeavors. It's not mere fantasy in this context, it's a powerful psychological activator. Consider the Pygmalion effect. This is that fascinating self-fulfilling prophecy where higher expectations actually lead to increased performance. Imagine a teacher who genuinely believes a student will excel. As a result, that student often does excel, not just because of the teacher's direct instruction, but because of the subtle encouragement and belief conveyed. Think of real-world examples. Elite athletes pushing through grueling training regimes, not just because it's their job, but because they hold a deep, sometimes almost irrational belief in their eventual triumph. Or entrepreneurs launching risky startups, dedicating countless hours, or students pushing themselves to master complex subjects. Their underlying belief in a positive outcome, a form of productive wishful thinking, often fuels their extraordinary efforts and makes them push boundaries they otherwise wouldn't. This isn't ignoring reality. It's believing in the possibility beyond the current reality and then acting to make it so.
Right, so it provides that internal push, that grit maybe, to keep going even when things are incredibly tough. It helps you stay in the fight.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's also incredibly powerful for building resilience and coping with adversity. In the face of life's inevitable setbacks, illness, loss, professional disappointments, even global crises, a degree of wishful thinking can serve as a vital psychological buffer. Maintaining hope during these periods, believing that things will get better, can provide crucial emotional support and prevent outright despair. It acts as a kind of psychological cushioning, allowing individuals to mentally process harsh realities over time rather than being overwhelmed by them all at once. Even things like positive affirmations, if they're grounded in a commitment to action rather than just passive waiting, can reinforce self-efficacy and promote a more resilient mindset, helping you slowly climb out of a dark place.
And creativity, how does it link there?
Ah, yes. It can spectacularly ignite creativity and innovation. Many groundbreaking ideas and inventions throughout history started as little more than a what-if vision, often without immediate, tangible evidence of feasibility. Think of the first airplane, or harnessing electricity, or even the internet. These were initially wishful thoughts in someone's mind, right? Visions of a reality that didn't yet exist. This imaginative leap beyond current limitations is a hallmark of innovation. It requires the willingness to believe in possibilities that don't yet exist, and then the drive to pursue them. From artists to scientists, individuals who push the boundaries of what's possible are often fueled by a strong, initially unsubstantiated belief in their vision. This creative aspect is absolutely essential for human progress.
And what about just our personal well-being? Does it actually make us happier or more psychologically sound day to day?
It absolutely can. A healthy dose of optimism, even when it borders on what you might call strategic wishful thinking, can contribute significantly to overall happiness and mental health. It can lead to reduced stress and anxiety, as focusing on desired positive outcomes offers a mental reprieve from negative rumination. Generally, optimistic individuals often report higher levels of life satisfaction, more positive moods, and even better social connections. And in medical contexts, a patient's hopeful outlook, while certainly not a magical cure, can profoundly influence their adherence to treatment protocols and their overall psychological state during recovery. And that, in turn, can impact physiological outcomes. It's about leveraging the mind's power for healing and endurance.
But there's always a flip side, isn't there? There has to be. What happens when this positive thinking goes too far and becomes utterly unchecked? Where does the line get drawn, and what are the real dangers?
Ah, yes, the dark side. It's crucial to understand this. When desires completely override objective reality, what was once a powerful source of motivation can transform into a pathway to incredibly poor decisions, profound disappointment, and a dangerously distorted view of the world. It's crucial to understand where that line is. The most significant peril is undoubtedly centrally poor decision-making. Unchecked wishful thinking actively clouds judgment, leading to choices that are detrimental, sometimes catastrophically so. We tend to ignore glaring red flags, dismiss contradictory evidence, or simply overlook clear indicators of risk because we want a certain outcome. This can manifest in everything from highly speculative, ill-advised investments and falling for get-rich-quick schemes, believing we'll be the exception to the rule, to staying in toxic relationships, convinced they'll magically improve without any real change, or neglecting crucial health precautions, thinking it won't happen to me. It makes us take unnecessary risks precisely because of an overly optimistic and unrealistic assessment of the situation.
So you make bad bets, essentially, in life.
Exactly. Then there's the inevitable outcome, inviting profound disappointment and demoralization. Sooner or later, reality has a way of asserting itself, doesn't it? Facts will emerge that contradict a wishful belief, leading to profound disappointment, frustration, anger, and even despair when that bubble bursts. This harsh clash with reality can also lead to heightened anxiety, chronic stress, and a devastating erosion of self-esteem as repeated failures or disillusionments damage self-confidence and your sense of efficacy.
That makes sense. It must be demoralizing when reality keeps hitting you.
It really is. It also insidiously leads to stagnation and lack of progress. A dangerous aspect of unchecked wishful thinking is its ability to create inertia. If you genuinely believe that circumstances will just get better on their own without requiring any personal effort, you become passive. You wait for things to happen. If you wish for a promotion without putting in the extra hours or desire improved health without making fundamental lifestyle changes, wishful thinking becomes an insidious excuse for avoiding necessary hard work, delaying difficult conversations, or postponing essential actions. Our sources even know that individuals with a high tendency towards wishful thinking are more likely to procrastinate unpleasant tasks. They operate under the deluded belief that they can magically do them faster or more efficiently later just because they wish it were true.
Ah, the classic procrastination fueled by optimism. I know that one too.
Right. And at its most extreme, unchecked wishful thinking can create a distorted reality and even delusion. The mind constructs a preferred, fantastical version of reality, making it incredibly difficult to objectively assess situations, people, or risks. Individuals with deeply ingrained wishful beliefs can become easy targets for manipulation, whether through elaborate financial scams or the manipulative tactics of cults, precisely because these things prey on that ingrained disregard for facts. In severe cases, it can contribute to pathological denial, where individuals refuse to acknowledge undeniable truths, such as a severe addiction or a critical illness, clinging to a false reality simply because the true one is too painful to bear.
Okay, so it's clearly about finding that crucial balance between hope and realism. What does this all mean for how we seek truth in the world, especially when our desires and biases are always at play, subtly influencing our perception? This brings us, I think, to a major philosophical movement that emerged precisely to establish a purely scientific and objective way of knowing: positivism.
Positivism really did emerge as a forceful intellectual movement in the 19th century. It was a direct response to what its proponents saw as speculative, unscientific, or purely metaphysical forms of knowledge. Its primary aim was to establish scientific rigor across all fields of inquiry, including the study of human society. Its origins lie with the French philosopher Auguste Comte, who back in 1848 proposed the positive method for social science. He argued emphatically that the study of society should move away from abstract logic, theological explanations, or vague metaphysics. Instead, it should focus purely on empiricism, that is, gathering concrete, verifiable data through direct sensory experiences and real-life observation, and then drawing conclusions strictly from the analysis of that data. For Comte, what could not be observed could not legitimately be known. It was quite radical.
So, observation above all else. What were the main ideas?
Classical positivism, as envisioned by Comte and his followers, had several fundamental tenets. First, the methodological unity of sciences, sometimes called naturalism. This posits that there's no fundamental difference between the social world studying human societies and the natural world studying physics or biology. The core idea was that scientific methods, as used in natural sciences, could and should be applied universally to understand human behavior and society. Imagine trying to use the exact same tools and principles you'd use to measure how a rock falls to understand why people form governments. That was the ambition. Second, empiricism, as we said, was paramount. All legitimate knowledge had to be derived solely from sensory experience and observable facts. If you couldn't see it, touch it, measure it, it wasn't scientific knowledge. Third, they insisted on a strict fact-value distinction. This meant that statements of fact, which could be empirically observed and verified, were to be kept entirely separate from normative statements, which involved values, beliefs, or moral judgments. This separation was seen as crucial for objective inquiry, preventing desires or subjective beliefs from contaminating scientific findings. The ultimate goal, as articulated by figures like Carl Gustav Hempel, was to explain and predict social phenomena via universal laws, much like Isaac Newton had done for the natural sciences.
And this evolved, didn't it, into what's known as logical positivism in the early 20th century. It feels like an even more extreme version of this quest for certainty.
Precisely. Yeah, it really was. In the early 20th century, groups like the Vienna Circle and the Berlin Society for Empirical Philosophy took Comte's ideas and pushed them to their logical extreme. They coined the term logical positivism in 1931. They were deeply influenced by the work of Ludwig Wittgenstein and adopted what became known as the verification principle. This principle asserted that a statement is only meaningful if it can be empirically verified. That is, if there's some way, at least in principle, to test whether it's true or false through observation or experience. If you say, there's a purple elephant in my kitchen, well, it's verifiable, even if unlikely. If you say the absolute exists, they would argue it's not verifiable and therefore not a meaningful statement in a scientific sense. It's just metaphysics.
So they wanted to throw out a lot of philosophy, essentially.
Pretty much, yes. Their primary task was not to discover new facts, but to clarify the meanings of concepts and avoid what they viewed as unanswerable questions concerning ultimate reality, metaphysics, or ethics. They considered these unproductive pseudo-problems. They believed that while creative arts could express visions and emotions, these should not claim to represent objective reality. What logical positivism positively recommended was a rigorous logic and methodology for validating all knowledge claims, stripping away anything that couldn't stand up to empirical scrutiny. It was an incredibly ambitious attempt to purify knowledge.
But this strong emphasis on pure empiricism, strict objectivity, and rejecting anything unverifiable, well, it didn't go unchallenged, did it? Here's where we see the philosophical counter-movements, and it seems like this quest for pure objectivity began to unravel a bit.
Indeed, it's one of the great intellectual dramas of the 20th century. Positivism, despite its initial appeal and influence, faced significant and ultimately devastating criticism that led to its evolution, or perhaps its decline. One major criticism was the fundamental blurring of natural and social worlds. Critics, particularly from interpretive traditions, argued forcefully that social structures are fundamentally different from natural phenomena. Why? Because they are shaped by the views, beliefs, and intentions of human agents. A rock doesn't know it's a rock. A social institution, like a marriage or a government, exists and changes precisely because people believe in it and act on those beliefs. Social phenomena change over time and location, and they don't exist independently of their human products, unlike, say, gravity or atomic structures. You can't really study a culture with the same tools you'd use to study a chemical reaction.
That seems like a pretty fundamental objection. What else?
Another significant weakness was its almost fantastical claim of certainty. The idea of utterly objective, value-free knowledge became increasingly problematic even within the natural sciences themselves. Developments in quantum physics, for instance, particularly the study of subatomic particles, showed phenomena like the observer effect, where the very act of observing a particle could alter its state. This profoundly questioned the possibility of pure, detached objectivity. If observing changes the observed, where's the pure objectivity? Philosopher Willard Van Orman Quine further critiqued this, arguing that sensory experience is always mediated by concepts. Observation is impossible without interpretation. We don't just see raw facts, we interpret them through our existing frameworks, languages, and theories. You can't have pure observation separate from the mind doing the observing.
So observation itself isn't pure, and then came Popper.
Yes, Karl Popper. Perhaps the most profound blow came from him with his revolutionary concept of falsifiability. Popper rejected the ideas of induction, building general laws from specific observations, and verification as the sole basis for scientific truth. He argued quite brilliantly that it only takes a single exception to nullify a universal truth claim. Observing a million white swans doesn't prove all swans are white, you just haven't seen the black one yet. You can't verify universal truth through finite observations. Instead, Popper argued, scientists should test theories deductively to falsify them. A theory is scientific not because it can be verified, but precisely because it can be potentially disproven or falsified by some conceivable observation. If a theory cannot, in principle, be falsified, then it isn't scientific. This shifted the burden from proving truth to actively seeking to disprove hypotheses, a fundamental reorientation of scientific inquiry.
Wow, that's a huge shift. So what came after positivism then? Did philosophy just give up on science?
Not at all. These criticisms led directly to the development of post-positivism, sometimes called post-empiricism. This wasn't a total rejection of the scientific method, not at all, but a crucial reaction and advancement. Post-positivists acknowledged the core criticism, that the researcher's theories, biases, background knowledge, and judgment can and do influence observations. They reject the idea of a perfectly objective individual observation. They recognize that all observations are, to some extent, theory-laden or value-laden, meaning they are filtered through our conceptual frameworks and values. This approach embraces methodological pluralism, accepting qualitative methods like interviews, ethnography, alongside quantitative ones like statistics. Critical realism, a common form of post-positivism, maintains that while an objective reality likely exists, our access to it is always mediated, imperfect, and fallible. Observations are fallible. Theories are always open to revision. It's about striving for objectivity, knowing you can never fully achieve pure, unbiased truth, but constantly refining your understanding through rigorous methods and awareness of bias.
Okay, so the idea of a purely objective, value-free science, even in the natural world, faced a lot of scrutiny. It became much more nuanced. Let's see how this plays out in a very practical field where rules, values, and facts constantly collide. Law. Legal positivism tackles this head-on, and it's perhaps one of the most critical applications of this whole fact-value distinction discussion.
Absolutely. Legal positivism, much like its broader philosophical counterpart, is really focused on two main streams, or goals. The first is its insistence on the separation thesis, the core idea that what law is and what law ought to be are separate matters. It's about differentiating between the formal validity of a law, Was it properly enacted by the right authority? And its moral merit. Is it a good or just law? The second stream, historically at least, was the goal of constructing a sophisticated legal science, believing that a sound theoretical account of law would clarify this very separation.
Okay, so law is one thing, morality is another. What are the implications of separating them so strictly?
The crucial implication is profound. No serious legal positivist argues that the systemic validity of law establishes its moral validity. Just because something is legally valid, passed by a legitimate authority, following due process, doesn't automatically mean it's morally right or that it should be obeyed without question. Now, legal positivists, much like even natural lawyers like Thomas Aquinas historically, acknowledge that a legal system can confer general benefits, predictability, stability, social order. These benefits might create a general obligation to obey, even laws that are perceived as morally imperfect, provided they're not too egregious, too unjust. Our sources brilliantly cite Martin Luther King Jr.'s stance on breaking unjust laws. He advocated doing so openly, lovingly, and with a willingness to accept the penalty. He saw this not as disrespect for the law, but as expressing the highest respect for the law, precisely because it highlights the moral separation from legal validity. He was essentially saying, this is the law, but it ought not to be the law, and I will highlight that distinction by accepting the consequences. It's a powerful example of the separation thesis in action.
That makes perfect sense. It's not just blind obedience. It's a deeper, more critical engagement with the law itself. But how does this view of law handle traditional ideas like law as simply a command from a sovereign?
Yeah, it fundamentally challenges what's known as the command theory, which was a cornerstone of early legal positivism, championed by figures like Jeremy Bentham and John Austin. They often saw law simply as commands issued by a sovereign, backed by sanctions or threats. However, this view is highly critiqued today because, well, in modern democracies, citizens are often both commanders, through elections, participation, and subjects. There isn't usually a single uncommanded commander like an absolute monarch. Moreover, many laws simply aren't just commands. Think about contract law, it's facilitative, it enables people to make binding agreements. Or laws granting authority to officials, those are power conferring. Or laws defining marriage, those are performative, they create a status. These functions just can't be realistically reduced to dictates backed by threats of punishment. It's too simplistic.
Okay, so it's more complex than just orders. What are the main schools of thought within legal positivism today, then?
Today we see two main schools highlighting the ongoing intellectual debate and nuance. First, there's exclusive legal positivism, championed by thinkers like Joseph Raz. They argue that moral criteria are never part of the criteria for a law's legality or validity. This means a legal system's validity can only be determined by non-moral sources, like whether it was enacted by a recognized legislature following the correct procedures. Morality is completely separate from legal identification. In contrast, there's inclusive legal positivism. They recognize that moral criteria can be part of an actual legal system if conventionally recognized within that system. For instance, if a constitution says laws must be fair or requires due process, then moral criteria are incorporated into the legal validity test by the law itself. However, our sources provide a critical cautionary note about inclusive positivism. While it seems more flexible and realistic, it can subtly obscure the original vital positivist point, that law can be bad even when it claims to be good. It's a reminder to always be skeptical of power, especially when it cloaks itself in the language of morality.
Right. So it's a powerful tool for critical analysis, a reminder to always be vigilant, even of laws that claim moral high ground. And how does this compare to, say, natural law theory, which holds that law is inherently rooted in morality?
This is where the distinction becomes incredibly sharp, yeah. Natural law theory posits that law is rooted in inherent moral principles, often seen as divine or discoverable through human reason, which exist independently of human decree. Think of the medieval philosopher Thomas Aquinas, who beautifully blended reason and faith to argue that human law must align with higher, natural, and divine law to be truly legitimate. Another compelling example is Islamic Shari'a, often understood as God's will or law, which is considered infallible in its divine source. However, even within Islam, fiqh, which is human jurisprudence or interpretation of Shari'a, is acknowledged as a human endeavor. This leads to diverse and sometimes competing schools of thought and evolving interpretations over centuries. This human element of interpretation shows that even divinely inspired law undergoes human construction and understanding in practice.
So even divinely inspired law requires human interpretation. Are there critiques of natural law, too?
Oh, definitely. There's what our sources call the reflexive sting for natural law. Historically, natural law ideas have sometimes been correlated with absolutist governments. The argument goes something like, if there's an absolute, objective good discoverable by reason or revelation, why should a potentially ignorant majority vote decide what's politically good? Shouldn't the wise rule? End quote. Modern human rights, too, while cherished by many in the West, have faced critiques from other cultural perspectives as a form of cultural imperialism. For instance, the strong emphasis on individual privacy might be viewed as secondary to communal well-being in other traditions. This highlights how concepts claiming universal moral grounding can still be perceived and applied very differently across diverse cultures, demonstrating that even universal moral claims aren't immune to interpretation and context.
That's a really important point about cultural context. So what's the key takeaway for our listener from this legal positivism discussion?
For you, the listener, the relevance here is absolutely vital, I think. Even when law expressly incorporates moral notions, using terms like fairness, reasonable, due process, the core separation thesis of legal positivism still applies. It's still crucial to ask, is this legally valid? And is it morally right? In fact, moral scrutiny should actually be heightened in these cases. Why? Because that moral overlay can give the law an enhanced claim to legitimacy, potentially making immoral or unjust laws harder to perceive, challenge, or expose because they sound good. It's a fundamental call to remain vigilant and critically evaluate, even perhaps especially when law claims to be good and just. It pushes us to ask, who decides what's good and why?
This entire discussion, how we seek truth, how our desires and biases affect perception, how even a field like law struggles with facts and values, it brings us to some of the most profound human questions imaginable, doesn't it? How do we find hope and meaning in life, especially when our faith and our scientific understanding seem to clash? Or when science appears to reduce everything to mere biology? This feels like where a lot of people struggle today, in a very personal and existential way.
It's an incredibly real and prevalent struggle in our contemporary world.
Yeah.
Our sources illuminate this by focusing on what they compellingly call crises of hope. These are profound existential crises that frequently manifest as deep depression, paralyzing hopelessness, and in severe cases, even suicidal thinking. What's particularly salient in our modern era is how these crises are often aggravated by perceived conflicts between deeply held faith beliefs and rapidly advancing scientific understanding. With the steady, breathtaking advances in neuroscience, genome research, behavioral sciences, there's a genuine risk that scientific understanding gets misunderstood. It can seem to imply that spiritual belief is misguided, or that life itself is inherently meaningless due to purely biological constraints. Of course, beyond this modern scientific context, classic precipitants for these crises of hope have always existed. The profound loss of loved ones, facing one's own mortality, or confronting the vast, seemingly indifferent universe.
So what are the core issues that come up in these crises?
In these crises of hope, three central existential issues typically emerge for individuals. Issues that seem to be directly challenged by a purely scientific, materialist worldview. First, the free will problem. This is that deep, nagging concern that if all thinking, all decisions, all emotions are ultimately traceable to neurobiological circuitry, just the firing of neurons and chemical reactions in the brain, then are we merely machines at the mercy of biological processes, with no real choice or autonomy? Does love just become a biochemical reaction? Is that all it is?
Right. The am I just a meat robot question.
Exactly. Second, mortality and its counterfactual. This is the fatalistic, nihilistic view. If all roads lead inevitably to death, then how can anything we do or create possibly mean anything? As Shakespeare's Macbeth famously laments, life becomes a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Why strive, why build, why love, if oblivion awaits?
The ultimate what's the point?
Precisely. And finally, the constraint of individual identity in human love. When traditional dualistic notions of an immaterial soul are rejected, perhaps because of scientific arguments, a person's spiritual identity can feel compromised or diminished. If I am just my brain, then what is me? How can deep human love, which feels so transcendent, so meaningful, be reconciled with a purely material existence?
Okay, these are the biggest, deepest philosophical and spiritual questions that science seems to be challenging, or at least narrowing the space for traditional answers. So how do we even begin to reconcile these, especially that first one, the free will problem? It seems to strike at the very core of what it means to be human.
Yeah. The profound reconciliation for the free will problem, and this is a central insight from our sources, comes through the philosophical concept of compatibilism. This is the elegant and I think quite powerful notion that free or autonomous decisions are, in fact, fully compatible with natural causation, with the cause-effect sequences of the natural world that science describes so well. The core fallacy that needs to be addressed in crises of hope is the often erroneous belief that predictability or biological determination necessarily means there's no room for genuine freedom or agency. That's the leap that causes the problem.
So cause and effect doesn't automatically rule out freedom. How does that work?
Well, philosopher John Perry illustrates this beautifully with a simple, relatable example. He considers his decision to choose a particular brand of milk at the grocery store. While his action might be entirely predictable based on, say, his wife's consistent preference, he argues that he could have at that very moment chosen a different brand. He had the capacity to override his usual reasons even if he didn't exercise it in that instance. That capacity to choose differently, to suspend an impulse or a predictable pattern, is a representation of freedom. John Locke similarly described this centuries ago, noting the mind's power to suspend desires. This capacity allows us the precious liberty to examine, view, and judge before acting, rather than being mere automatons reacting to stimuli.
Okay, so the ability to pause and choose differently is key.
Exactly. And building on this, Daniel Dennett, in his influential work Elbow Room, further emphasizes that our neural architecture, the physical structure of our brains, allows an act to simultaneously be an effect of physical causation and the result of rational will. This isn't a contradiction. It's a sophisticated emergent property. He argues that the human brain approximates a semantic engine, a meaning generator, through constant self-reflection and the creation of self-made selves. Our brain's remarkable capacity for self-redesign through learning, self-reflection, conscious choice mediates not only freedom, but also our very identity and creativity within a living system. So yes, your thoughts and decisions are products of your brain, but your brain is also incredibly plastic, shaped by those very thoughts and decisions over time. It's a dynamic loop.
That makes a lot of sense. It's not just one-way traffic from biology to thought. But doesn't this whole compatibilist argument intentionally avoid the question of a soul or some immaterial part of us? Is that a deliberate choice, and why?
Yes, it's a very deliberate and critical choice, in this particular reconciliation framework presented in the sources. The article intentionally avoids invoking dualism, the traditional idea of an immaterial soul or spiritual entity that is separate from and interacts with the physical brain. From a purely scientific perspective, dualism presents profound challenges. For instance, if an immaterial agent could truly disrupt or initiate a physical process in the brain, it would seem to violate fundamental conservation laws of mass and energy, which are cornerstones of physics. How does the non-physical move the physical? More importantly, perhaps, from the perspective of alleviating crises of hope, dualism, paradoxically, can reduce perceived human autonomy. If you feel controlled by your brain or by an external spiritual entity pulling the strings, both scenarios can feel equally compromising to your sense of free will. The power doesn't ultimately reside with you in either case.
That's a really interesting point about dualism potentially reducing agency. So what's the key insight instead?
The truly critical insight here, and this is a profound nugget for you, the listener, is that belief in one's own freedom is a necessary condition for having free will. It's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. If you believe you are just a machine, you tend to act like one. If you believe you have no agency, no real choice, you effectively give it up. You don't exercise the freedom you might have. The absence of faith in one's own agency can sabotage freedom through this self-fulfilling prophecy of helplessness. Our unique human capacity for language allows us to extend our goals beyond mere physical limits and to reason beyond immediate evolutionary practicality, fostering a deeper, more intentional form of freedom.
Can you give an example of how this plays out?
Absolutely. Our sources provide a powerful example in Clinical Vignette 1, the case of JL, a 24-year-old accountant. After suffering a concussion, he became utterly convinced that his awareness of God, his morality, his very choices depended solely on his brain chemistry. He read some neuroscience and misinterpreted it, basically. This led him to believe he had no control over his decisions. He just capitulated to every impulse, lost all motivation, neglected his job, and descended into a really fatalistic despair and heavy drinking. His recovery began not through some complex theological debate, but when he identified a close loved one as a higher power, a tangible material manifestation of care and support in his life. Through this connection, he recognized how his assumption of helplessness, driven by a misinterpretation of neuroscience, had utterly sabotaged him. By reconciling his notion of God, and by extension, meaning and purpose, with spirituality manifesting tangibly in the material world and relationships, his sense of agency was restored and his severe depression resolved. This highlights how our belief in our own freedom is not just philosophical, it's profoundly practical and foundational for mental health and well-being.
That's a truly profound connection. The belief in freedom fueling the capacity for freedom. It's almost circular, but in a positive, empowering way. So what about the next big crisis of hope? Mortality. If death is inevitable, what's the point of anything? Why not just give up?
That's the core of the fatalistic perspective, yeah. Often articulated, as you mentioned, by Shakespeare's Macbeth. Life's but a walking shadow, signifying nothing. It's a deeply human, terrifying thought. But the reconciliation here is that mortality, counterintuitively perhaps, actually enhances meaning rather than negating it. Our sources brilliantly deconstruct this desperate perspective by having us consider the counterfactual. What if there were no such thing as mortality? What if we live forever? In this scenario, allegorically depicted in films like Groundhog Day or even some vampire narratives, immortality might actually make decisions utterly meaningless. If you have an eternity to make up for any mistake, if there are no ultimate consequences because time is infinite, then every choice loses its gravity, its urgency, its preciousness. There's no pressure to make the most of now.
Huh. Immortality as the enemy of meaning. I hadn't thought of it that way.
Right. Mortality, in fact, creates urgency. It makes our time-limited decisions incredibly precious and impactful. Think of the compelling story of St. Francis de Sales, a 16th century Catholic bishop. As a young man, he grappled with intense spiritual despair, convinced he was predestined for damnation based on the theology of the time. After accepting what he believed was his unworthiness of heaven, he had a profound shift. He decided essentially, even if I'm damned, I will still serve God and make the most of the only life I have right now. This radical acceptance of mortality and its potential finality spurred him into a life of extraordinary productivity, including extensive missionary work and prolific writing. His motivation was based not on wishful thinking about heaven, but on what he could do in service of the divine and humanity in the here and now during his finite time on earth. This view of mortality functions as a kind of mercy, disarming those nihilistic preoccupations by giving meaning to effort and choice within our limited lifespan.
That's a powerful story. Does this play out in modern contexts too?
Absolutely. Clinical Vignette 2 further illustrates this powerful dynamic. We hear about a college student who plunged into despair over mortality after a painful breakup. This triggered doubts about her belief in heaven, making her feel life was meaningless if it just ended. When her therapist, using this framework, asked her to explore a hypothetical scenario of immortality, she gradually realized, like in the Groundhog Day example, that an endless existence actually diminished meaning for her. The urgency was gone. Nothing would ultimately matter. She then found genuine hope not by returning to a belief in heaven, but by channeling her energy into championing the quality of life for others now. Seeing herself as a vital link in a chain of causation across generations, contributing to something larger than herself that would outlast her physical life. Her anxiety about death dissipated as she focused on intentional decisions to help others in the present. Our sources also compellingly link anxiety over choice, as described by existential philosophers like Kierkegaard, not necessarily as a paralyzing fear, but as a potential driver of creativity and virtuous concern. It's the very finiteness that makes our choices, our love, and our actions truly matter.
That truly reframes death, not as an end to meaning, but as a profound catalyst for it. It makes our time here more, not less significant.
Wow. What about the third issue then, the perceived constraint of individual identity and human love when you reject a dualistic view of the soul? If we're just material beings, doesn't spiritual identity feel diminished? And what about the profound depth of human love? How does that fit?
This is an incredibly crucial point for reconciliation, yeah. And it touches on the deepest parts of human experience. When the traditional notion of an immaterial soul is set aside, the question naturally arises, how do we define our spiritual identity? And what then is the ultimate source and meaning of profound human love? The answer, incredibly, lies in love-based decision-making, a concept that is both deeply spiritual and entirely observable within a materialist framework.
Okay, love-based decision-making, what does that entail? Consider 12-step programs, which often require individuals to turn their lives over to a higher power. Our sources emphasize that this higher power doesn't necessarily have to be supernatural or traditionally religious. It can be an enduring, tangible relationship with a trusted friend, a family member, or a supportive spiritual community. This grounding of the higher power in the material world in human connection makes it accessible and verifiable, not abstract. Love, then, when construed as a conscious decision rather than just a fleeting emotion, involves exercising our profound human freedom to place the needs of another over the needs of self, often without condition or expectation of reciprocity. This is incredibly powerful. As evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins in The Selfish Gene famously notes, humans have the power to defy the selfish genes of our birth through acts of pure, disinterested altruism, something he acknowledges has no place in nature from a purely biological, self-preservation perspective. We can choose to act against our purely selfish biological drives. This decision to love, to act altruistically, is a profound break from evolutionarily preserved self-preservation impulses. It's considered the ultimate manifestation of free will, leading to the meaningful bringing into being of what would otherwise have existed like a truly selfless relationship, a family built on deep affection, or a work of art or charity motivated by profound compassion. In this sense, we become co-creators of meaning, actively shaping reality through our choices to love.
So, love itself becomes a material manifestation of the divine almost, a tangible bridge between science and faith. That's a striking idea.
Precisely. Love is often considered a principal signature of the divine, famously stated in 1 John 4.8, God is love. This conceptualization means the material realm, the very world we can observe and measure, becomes the common ground for spirituality and science. It makes spirituality observable, tangible, and deeply human, not something entirely separate. This approach also naturally leads to self-transcendence, which, in this view, is not about escaping the body but an intentional reconstruction of identity to include others. Walt Whitman's preface to Leaves of Grass beautifully captures this. Love the earth and sun. Devote your income and labor to others. Re-examine all you have been told. Dismiss whatever insults your own soul. This intentional reframing of identity based on freedom and love-based decision-making becomes entirely compatible with science and observably powerful in the here and now.
And how does community fit into this?
This expanded identity naturally leads to the formation of spiritual community. Mutual investment in love-based decision-making by pairs or entire communities provides the rich substrate for a profound spiritual community. The Zulu word Ubuntu, often translated as I am because we are, perfectly encapsulates this redefinition of identity, which transcends mere temporal and corporal limits. It is an incredibly powerful source of resilience, meaning, and interconnectedness, grounded in shared action. Ultimately, this entire framework suggests a kind of bottom-up spirituality, where critical aspects of spiritual life like freedom, meaning, and love arise as emergent properties of the complex interactions of brain, mind, and human relationships, rather than being imposed from an external supernatural source. This firmly rejects reductionism, the idea that wholes can be explained simply by decomposing them into their constituent parts. Instead, it suggests that complex phenomena, like consciousness or spirituality, emerge from the interaction of simpler parts, but are not reducible to those parts. They are something more. Observable manifestations of human spirituality, like unconditional love and altruism, can thus serve as a powerful, tangible anchoring hope for those who are perplexed or in crisis, providing profound meaning within the observable world.
What's truly fascinating here, and kind of paradigm shifting for me, is that the source suggests spirituality is actually better off when it fully incorporates scientific truth. Just as science clarified why the sun rises and sets, replacing divine intervention with gravitational force, it seems science can refine, not destroy, faith. This isn't about choosing between science and faith, is it? It's about how science can provide a more robust, resilient foundation for hope.
It's absolutely not about choosing between them. No. To believe otherwise, to contend that one must choose between science and faith, is a position our sources explicitly reject. This synthesis offers a powerful blueprint for contemporary reconciliation, especially necessary in a world where crises of hope are so prevalent, often fueled by exactly that perceived conflict. Science continuously clarifies what can and cannot realistically be invoked as a foundation of religious or spiritual belief. It helps delineate the territory. This integration opens new avenues of dialogue, widens the playing field for spiritual formation, and allows for a more profound and resilient sense of hope, one that can stand up to the most rigorous scientific scrutiny, because it's grounded in observable reality and human experience. It allows faith to evolve and deepen, just as our scientific understanding of the universe does.
We've taken a truly remarkable deep dive today, wow. From the intricate inner workings of your brain and its inherent biases, to the grand philosophical quest for objective knowledge, and ultimately to some of the most profound human questions about meaning, freedom, and love. We've seen how wishful thinking isn't a simple concept at all, but a powerful, double-edged force. When understood and managed, it can fuel our greatest achievements, but it can also lead us down perilous paths. Now, let's bring it all back to practical tools for you, our listener. The key here, it seems, is not to extinguish hope we need hope, but to cultivate what our sources call a sophisticated form of optimism.
That's right. That's the goal. The aim is to harness hope's incredible motivational power while simultaneously mitigating its potential to distort reality and lead to poor decisions. It requires a conscious, intentional blend of realistic optimism, rigorous critical thinking, and profound self-awareness. It's about being grounded, yet still reaching for the stars, you know?
Okay, let's turn these rich insights into concrete action. How can you listening, leverage our brain's innate capacity for hope without falling into self-delusion? What are the actionable strategies we can employ in our daily lives?
Okay, the first and perhaps most foundational step is to cultivate deep self-awareness. This means actively recognizing the patterns of your own mind. When do your desires most heavily influence your beliefs about an outcome? Are you consistently downplaying risks or exaggerating positive possibilities? Ask yourself honestly, am I seeing the situation as it truly is or as I wish it were? It also means identifying your emotional triggers. What emotions like anxiety, fear of failure, a strong desire for comfort tend to precede your moments of wishful thinking? Understanding these triggers helps you anticipate and maybe adjust your thinking before it takes hold. A powerful practice here is mindfulness, just observing your thoughts without immediate judgment. This allows you to identify when a belief is based more on desire than on verifiable evidence.
Okay, know thyself, essentially. What's next?
Next, you absolutely need to practice rigorous critical thinking. This is about actively seeking objective evidence that supports or contradicts your beliefs. Don't just look for information that confirms what you want to be true. That's confirmation bias again. Play devil's advocate with your own ideas. Intentionally consider opposing viewpoints, potential negative outcomes, alternative scenarios. Force yourself to see the other side. For any significant decision, use detailed pros and cons lists, but critically evaluate the evidence or likelihood associated with each point, not just how much you desire it. And importantly, seek diverse perspectives from trusted sources, friends, mentors, experts, and ask for their honest assessments, even if they're uncomfortable to hear. As much as we love our own internal narrative, external input provides a vital reality check.
So it's about being your own internal fact checker, but also inviting others to help scrutinize your blind spots. Makes sense.
Precisely. Then you need to embrace constructive optimism. This isn't blind faith in a magical outcome. It's a powerful, action-oriented approach that leverages the benefits of optimism while remaining firmly rooted in reality. Distinguish clearly between realistic hope, which focuses on desired outcomes and fuels effort, and unrealistic expectation, which simply presumes a positive outcome without sufficient basis or action. Focus your energy squarely on what you can control. Direct your efforts toward actions within your sphere of influence rather than dwelling on outcomes purely subject to chance or external factors. Develop contingency plans. Prepare for setbacks, for detours, so you're ready if things don't go exactly as planned. This builds resilience. And critically, foster action-oriented optimism. Always frame your positive outlook with a commitment to action. Instead of just, I hope I get that job, it's, I hope I get that job, and I will prepare thoroughly for the interview, send a compelling cover letter, and follow up diligently. It's belief plus effort.
Right. Hope isn't a strategy, action is. And when things inevitably don't go as planned, as they often do, how do we handle that without falling into despair or cynicism?
That's where you truly learn from failure and disappointment. Rather than just lamenting setbacks or blaming external factors, self-serving bias, analyze them objectively. What information did you miss? What assumptions were incorrect? What part of your thinking was wishful rather than realistic? Use the new information gleaned from setbacks to refine your future expectations and strategies. This iterative process of learning, adjusting, and iterating is absolutely crucial for genuine growth and building lasting resilience. Every failure is just a data point for a more accurate future map.
Any other specific techniques?
Yes. Another incredibly powerful tool, borrowed from project management actually, is to develop a pre-mortem strategy. Before embarking on a new project, a significant decision, or pursuing a major goal, imagine that it has already failed, catastrophically, like total disaster. Then brainstorm all the possible reasons why it might have failed, get it all out there. This proactive exercise helps you uncover potential risks, blind spots, and points of wishful thinking that might otherwise be obscured by your optimism, allowing you to mitigate them before they become actual problems. It's like stress testing your plan against reality.
That's clever. Look for the failure points in advance.
Exactly. And finally, and this is so important for sustainable motivation, focus on process, not just outcome. Celebrate small wins. Acknowledge the progress you make along the way rather than solely fixating on the final distant outcome. This builds sustainable motivation, reinforces the power of consistent grounded effort, and keeps you engaged even when the ultimate goal feels far off. These strategies, when consistently applied, empower you to dream big while remaining grounded, leading to genuinely achievable futures, fueled by hope, but guided by realism.
What a remarkable deep dive we've taken today, really, from the inner workings of your brain and its inherent biases, all the way to the grand philosophical quests for knowledge and meaning, and even to the practical applications in law in our daily lives. We've seen how wishful thinking isn't a simple concept, but a powerful, often unconscious force that, when understood and managed, can fuel our greatest achievements, transform our perception of reality, and redefine our deepest hopes.
The core message, I think, is this. You possess the capacity for immense freedom and profound meaning, not despite, but within the observable world that science describes. By embracing scientific truth, recognizing the transformative power of love-based decisions as a tangible force in the world, and grounding your hopes in critical intentional thinking, you can cultivate a profound sense of purpose, resilience, and genuine agency. It's about knowing what you can control, discerning what lies beyond your direct influence, and understanding where your greatest power truly lies, in your choices, your actions, your connections, even in the face of what might seem unknowable or daunting.
A final thought for you to carry with you today. Consider how much of your daily life, your decisions, your feelings are shaped by what you wish to be true versus what you know or can reasonably infer to be true based on evidence. And then maybe ask yourself, how might a more intentional balance of these two, this beautiful, complex interplay of desire and discernment, lead you to a richer, more effective, and perhaps profoundly more hopeful path forward in your own life?